Hey artists, here are some general, very basic reminders when working with watercolor. So first of all, I have my materials set up. Here, you can see I have some paper towel just in case I have a mistake. I'm working on a piece of watercolor paper. That is always the best way to start watercolor painting. I have my watercolor paint palette here, my all-important water to make colors, plus my brush. My paper already has a drawing on it in Sharpie marker. So if you're going to use anything with watercolor, it needs to be permanent. If it's water-based, it will run when it gets wet. So that's your first important reminder. Then, when you begin to make your watercolors, you should recall, but here's your reminder, that the more water you add, the darker of a color you're going to create. So if I want to mix up some red paint and I add one brush full of water, it's going to make a very dark red. In fact, it's not going to make much for watercolor paint. It's going to look almost like poster paint. So the more water droplets you add, you're going to end up getting a lighter color, but you'll also be able to create more paint at once. So if you have a larger area, you'd want to begin by mixing up a larger puddle of paint. Then when you paint, treat your paintbrush like a small broom. So that means applying your brush and pulling strokes of paint with your paintbrush. Okay? What you shouldn't do, unless you're doing it on purpose for some sort of technique and effect, is scrub with your brush. So if you wanted this textured look, great. But if not, you just end up with a brush that actually is a little bit ruined. Not that these brushes were very good to begin with. When you paint with watercolor, it's very important to keep in mind what is wet on your paper and what is dry. So this purple space I painted earlier, and therefore if I wanted to paint next to it, I would be perfectly fine. So let me mix up some green. The more water I add, the lighter my color will get. So if I want to mix up a very pale green, I'll add lots of water, and I won't scrub at it for a long time with my brush, because the more you do that, the more it activates that cake of watercolor paint. So I can paint next to this purple, no problem, because it is dry. If I were to try and go paint next to that red that I just applied and is still shiny and wet, in fact, what would happen is these colors would begin to bleed into each other. If you want a flat wash, remember, you want to work quickly to pull out the wet edge of that paint so you don't have any puddles. Otherwise, you won't get a flat wash. You'll start to have edges where things have dried and they'll leave lines in your paint. And if you don't want that, that would be bad. If you do want that, that's fine. Okay? Now that I've gotten my green done here, I can show you what will happen. If I go and add that right in next to the, oh, you see that? The wet paper here of the red pulled that green in, and now they're going to mix. And now the red is flowing into the green too. You see that little spot there? Yuck. They will mix together. One way you can try to save that, it might not be successful, is to use your paper towel, sort of like a, I'm missing the word right now, to suck up that paint. So I've sort of removed some on my paper towel. I can go back. Once that's dry, don't mess with it now. It's too late. Do not mess. Oh, the green is still bleeding over in there. Oh my goodness. I can try to fix that later, but the best thing you can possibly do is just keep an eye on what shapes are wet or what areas of your paper are wet and what areas are dry, so you don't have to play with trying to correct those mistakes. If you're not happy with the richness of your pigment, you can always add multiple layers. So last tip would be, if I want this purple to be darker and more intense, I can go add another layer of purple on top to make a darker color. But I caution you about this. Some of the beauty of watercolor is its translucency. It is not about having a thick paint that looks like tempera or acrylic or something else. It is about having something that is sometimes pale, but it is translucent, see-through. When you cake it on very thick, you kind of lose that beautiful appeal of watercolor. And even though you might like the darker colors, you start to look like you're just trying to fake having a different type of paint entirely. And that is not what we want to use our materials for. So those are your basic reminders when working with watercolor paint.